While I was at my father's funeral, my mother gave my fiancé an envelope and whispered, "You deserve better." He read it and left me that night. 2 months later, she opened a gift at her retirement party and started screaming when she saw what was inside. I'm Celia, 38, and this story takes place mostly in Portland, Oregon. I had a seemingly stable life. A decent career in publishing, a long-term fiancé named Rowan, and the kind of routine that felt comforting, if not perfect. Until my father died. And everything unraveled. My dad, Howard, was my anchor. Quiet, rational, and deeply kind. He was the reason I made it through so much of my childhood without completely falling apart. My mother, Arlene, was difficult. Always critical. Always cold. I spent most of my adult life trying to win her approval while pretending I didn't care. She never liked Rowan. From the very beginning, she called him passive and unimpressive. To me, Rowan was gentle and smart, supportive without being pushy. We had plans to get married in the fall. A small wedding near the Columbia River Gorge, nothing fancy. Just people we loved and nature all around us. My father had been sick for about a year with pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came fast, the decline even faster. Through it all, Rowan was my rock. He drove my dad to chemo appointments. He sat with me when I couldn't form words. He never once complained. My mother never acknowledged any of it. The funeral was a cold day in February. Overcast skies, icy wind, and that hollow atmosphere that makes every sound echo a little louder than it should. We held the service at the same church where my parents got married. It was packed with people, former students of my mom, old neighbors, co-workers of my dad. I was sitting in the front pew when it happened. I didn't see it. While I was holding my breath through the eulogy, trying not to cry, my mother leaned in close to Rowan in the back of the church. She pressed an envelope into his hands. Whispered something. He told me later what she said, "You deserve better." She said it like it was a kindness. That night, Rowan sat me down in my dad's study. The house was still filled with casserole dishes and sympathy cards. The air smelled like lilies and stale coffee. "I read the letter," he said. "I didn't want to, but I did. I thought maybe it was some kind of weird gesture. I expected her to say something like, 'Don't let her emotions ruin your life,' or 'She's too fragile for someone like you.' But what she actually wrote was worse than anything I imagined. 4 pages. Typed. She went through every flaw I had. From childhood tantrums to college breakups. She described me as emotionally unstable, codependent, difficult to love. She painted a picture of a woman drowning, pulling everyone around her down. And Rowan believed her. Or at least, part of him did. He said he needed space. That it opened things up in his mind he hadn't thought about. That maybe he was staying out of obligation. He left that night. In the days that followed, I spiraled. I was grieving my father, my relationship, and now, what felt like my entire past. I confronted my mom a few days later. She didn't even flinch. "I only told him the truth," she said, sipping her coffee like it was a regular Tuesday. "You're too intense for someone like him. Better now than after a wedding and a divorce." "You couldn't even wait until after Dad's funeral?" I asked. She raised an eyebrow. "I didn't want to ruin your day. It was his funeral, not yours." The emotional gymnastics of that statement still baffle me. I didn't speak to her for weeks. Not even when she texted me that she was planning her retirement party. She wanted me to attend because appearances matter. I told her nothing. I just showed up the night of the party, kept to myself, and brought a gift. Not just any gift. It was something I found in my father's desk drawer. A photo. It showed my mom kissing another man. Dr. Craig Bellamy, the former superintendent of her school district. The timestamp showed it was taken during a conference they both attended when I was 13. I remember that trip. I stayed with my grandparents while Mom and Dad took a much-needed weekend. The photo was tucked into a manila folder, along with a note my dad had written but never sent. A letter to me. In it, he said he'd known about the affair for years. That he chose to stay for my sake. That he forgave her, but it had broken something in him. He said he didn't want to burden me with the truth while he was alive. But he hoped someday I'd understand the kind of love that stays, even when it hurts. I photocopied the letter. At the party, the moment came when she opened the box. There was a pause. Her hand stilled. Her face drained of color. And then she screamed. When I say she screamed, I don't mean the shocked kind of gasp you hear when someone's surprised by a prank or touched by a heartfelt message. This was primal. Guttural. A sound that cut through the laughter and wine clinking around the room like a blade. The kind of scream you hear when someone realizes they've just lost control of a narrative they spent decades shaping. People froze. Heads turned. A server dropped a tray of champagne glasses. And there she was, standing at the front of a room full of teachers, administrators, former students, and district officials, clutching the photo like it was on fire. Her hand shook so badly she dropped the envelope with my father's letter still inside. I didn't move. I sat at my table, halfway back in the room, sipping my ginger ale with my heart pounding in my throat. I could see the confusion spreading like wildfire. Whispers. Then someone picked up the letter. A former colleague of hers, Mrs. Nguyen, I think. She read a few lines before my mother yanked it out of her hand and stuffed it back into the box. She scanned the room, searching for me. I didn't avert my gaze. I wanted her to know I saw her. She opened her mouth like she was going to shout something at me, maybe call me a liar or accuse me of betrayal, but all that came out was a trembling, half-swallowed sob. She turned and stormed out, dragging the box with her, bumping into chairs and knocking over a centerpiece. Two of her closest friends, also retired principals, hurried after her. One of them glanced back at me with a look that was somewhere between pity and disgust. I stayed in my seat, still. Heavy. Unmoving. For the first time in my life, my mother didn't own the room. She fled it. The party fizzled out after that. People lingered for a bit, unsure of what to say or do. I had one or two people approach me, gentle, cautious, asking if I was okay. I'm fine, I told them, and I meant it in the strangest way. I wasn't fine, not in the way that word usually means. But I wasn't unraveling. I felt grounded in something I hadn't felt in years. Truth. I didn't stick around for dessert. I walked the 4 blocks back to my car and drove home in silence. The city was still lit up, bright windows in condos, couples walking past bars on Division Street, teenagers laughing in line for food carts, but I felt like I was moving through a completely different reality. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring out the window at the cold glow of streetlights. The box with the original letter and photo was locked in my safe. I hadn't told anyone else. Not Rowan. Not my therapist. Not even my closest friend, B, who had always known my mother wasn't easy, but didn't know the depths of it. I thought the fallout would be immediate. I thought I'd wake up to messages, phone calls, threats even. But there was only silence. Until 2 days later. She texted me first. "We need to talk." That was extremely inappropriate and cruel. I didn't reply. Then came another. "I deserve an explanation for your behavior." Still nothing from me. A third one, "Your father would be ashamed of what you did." That one nearly got me. But it didn't. Because the truth is, she didn't know what my father would feel. Not really. He'd spent so much of his life swallowing things to keep the peace, and I now saw how much of that was for my sake. I wasn't going to inherit that silence. A few more days passed. Then she called. I didn't answer. She called again the next day, and the next. Voicemails. Emails. A Facebook message, "Yes, really." The last one simply said, "I'm still your mother." And that's what made it all so twisted. Because she was. She is. And yet, she never protected me. Not once. Not emotionally, not when I was growing up, and not as an adult when I needed her to simply let me be loved. She broke my engagement with a few sheets of paper and a cruel whisper. And she did it on the day I buried my father. Now she wanted to talk. But only because I'd made her look bad. Only because the walls she built out of image and control had been knocked over in one public, undeniable moment. Rowan reached out again. He texted me a link to a local education blog. Someone had written a post about the uncomfortable drama at a respected principal's retirement party. It didn't name names, but it didn't need to. Then he followed up with, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have left. I know that now. I just believed her. I didn't even know why until I saw what she did at that party." I stared at that message for a long time. I thought about all the times Rowan had supported me. And then I thought about how fast he'd walked away when my mother handed him a story about me that was designed to break us. Not a question. Not a conversation. Just belief. Part of me still loved him. I didn't reply to Rowan's message right away. I sat with it for a few days. I'd learned to stop reacting in the moment, to let the pain settle before I reached into it. That was something I never got to do before, not with my mother always looming, always narrating my life for me like she knew better. Rowan and I had 5 years together. He knew my rhythms, my fears, my dad's favorite songs. He knew how I liked my tea, how I arranged my books by mood instead of genre. He knew the difference between when I was overwhelmed and when I was shutting down. And yet, he didn't know me enough not to believe a letter. That was the hardest part to swallow. I hadn't realized how much of myself I had to defend in the past just to stay in that relationship. Not because Rowan demanded it, but because my mother's voice had been embedded in me for so long, I started doing her work for her. And now that voice had turned to silence. The week after the party, I found myself standing in the frozen food aisle of a New Seasons market, staring blankly at a wall of organic lasagnas, holding back tears. Not because of Rowan. Because I saw a woman helping her elderly mother read a nutrition label. She was gentle, patient. And her mother smiled at her like they were best friends. And I realized I never had that. Not once. My mother and I had been locked in a decades-long Cold War, but instead of guns, we used silence, sarcasm, manipulation, and guilt. And for most of my life, I'd confused her control for love. Her sharp words for wisdom. Her absence of affection for strength. Now I couldn't unsee it. B came over that weekend. She brought wine, takeout, and her stubborn presence. She sat on my couch, kicked off her shoes, and said, "Okay. Let's talk about it. Everything. I'm not leaving until you do." I didn't even try to resist. I told her everything, from the funeral, to the envelope, to the retirement party. When I got to the part about the letter my dad wrote, the one he never gave me, the one I found after he died, B sat up straight. "He knew," she said softly. "All those years?" "He knew," I nodded. "He stayed because of me." And she knew he knew. They just never talked about it. B looked away for a second, biting her lip. Then she said, "You didn't blow up that party to be cruel, Celia. You did it because she took everything from you and thought she could walk away without consequence. That wasn't revenge. That was reckoning." It was the first time someone gave language to what I'd done without making me feel like I'd committed a war crime. Another week passed. Then came the letter. Handwritten. Mailed. No return address, but I knew the handwriting the second I saw it. My mother's. It was 8 pages long. Not a single line crossed out, no edits, no messiness, of course not. She'd probably drafted it 6 times before committing to ink. She started with how disturbed and humiliated she felt after the retirement party. She called my actions calculated and vindictive. She wrote that my father's version of events was biased by his depression, and that I was too fragile to understand the full scope of adult life. Then, toward the end, a shift. She wrote, "Despite everything, I am your mother. I gave you life. I want to mend this, but I need to know you're capable of looking at your part in all of this." My part. Even in a letter that pretended to extend an olive branch, she couldn't stop herself from twisting the blade. It's a strange thing to grieve a parent who is still alive. I'd already mourned my dad. Every day since he passed, I missed him in ways both small and massive. His voice. His silence. The way he always smelled like cedar and toothpaste. The way he left me little notes on the fridge when I stayed over. But now, I was mourning my mother too. Not because she had died, but because the idea of her, the hope of her, had. She would never be the mom I needed. She would never be soft. She would never admit she was wrong without conditions. She would never say, "I hurt you and I'm sorry," without following it with, "But you hurt me too." And I was done chasing that. I started seeing a new therapist, an older woman named Judith who reminded me a little of a librarian I had in elementary school. Soft-voiced, unshakable, razor-sharp. In one of our first sessions, I told her everything. She didn't interrupt, didn't look shocked. When I finished, she said something that stuck with me: "Some people call it revenge. But sometimes it's just the truth arriving at an inconvenient time." I think about that sentence a lot. Especially now that my mother's social circle is shrinking. A few people from the district quietly reached out to me, nothing overt, just soft acknowledgments. "I always admired your dad." Or, "You were brave." It didn't make things better. But it chipped away at the guilt I'd been taught to carry. Rowan kept trying. He sent a letter too. His wasn't polished. It had scratch-outs, and he spelled irreparable wrong. But it was real. He said he regretted walking away. That he let someone else define me and that he hated himself for it. He didn't ask to come back, just to talk. I still haven't decided what to do with that. There's a strange stillness in my life now. Like I'm on the edge of a field after a storm, and the wind is just starting to settle. Everything feels unfamiliar, but clearer. Like the clutter has been swept away and now I can finally see the ground beneath my feet. And maybe, for the first time in my life, I get to choose where to step next, without anyone narrating it for me. I think what surprised me most in the days that followed wasn't my mother's silence, it was how easy it became for me not to reach for it. I used to live in a state of low-level anxiety, always wondering how she'd react to something I said, how I could manage her mood, how to word things just right to avoid being accused of overreacting or being too sensitive. I thought I'd feel the absence of that dynamic like a missing limb. But instead, it was more like taking off a pair of shoes that never fit. There were blisters I hadn't realized I'd been walking on for years. Even the smallest things changed. I could decorate my apartment the way I wanted without hearing her voice in my head critiquing the color palette. I could go 3 full days without checking my phone for a guilt-laced message. I could cry without wondering if she'd call it a performance. It was freedom in microscopic increments. But with that freedom came space. And in that space, the questions started to echo louder. What do I do with someone who gave me life but spent most of it making me feel like I wasn't worth loving without conditions? What do I do with someone who tore down my relationship, then demanded I meet her halfway? And then there was Rowan. His last message to me sat unopened for nearly a week. It wasn't that I didn't want to read it, it was that I didn't want to be pulled back into a chapter one was halfway through closing. But a part of me, maybe the part still curled around the memory of those quiet mornings with him, coffee in hand, crossword puzzles between us, couldn't let it go entirely. So I opened it. It was short. "I don't expect anything. I just want you to know that I'm still rooting for you. Always was, even when I didn't act like it." No request. No pressure. Just a sentence that hung in the air like fog, soft, but hard to navigate through. One Saturday, I drove out to Hood River, to a little spot my dad used to love, Mitchell Point, right along the Columbia River Gorge. He'd take me there when I was a kid, when Mom was busy with school board meetings or hosting luncheons. We'd climb part of the trail, sit on a rock with sandwiches, and just look. At water, at trees, at whatever season was stretching across the hills. That day, I sat in the exact same place we used to eat lunch. The view hadn't changed. But everything inside me had. I pulled out the envelope with my dad's letter. The real one. Not the copy I gave my mother at her party, the original, creased in the corners from the number of times I'd unfolded it. There was something in that letter I hadn't fully absorbed the first few times I read it. A single line I kept skipping over, like my heart wasn't ready to land on it. Don't become her, even in anger. I don't know if my dad meant that as a warning or a prayer. But I started to understand what it meant. Because I'd been walking a line. Yes, my mother hurt me. Yes, she manipulated. Yes, she crossed lines that no parent ever should. But if I wasn't careful, I'd become so wrapped up in exposing her, in proving my pain, that I'd tether myself to her in a different way, through resentment instead of approval. I didn't want that to be the legacy. I didn't want her to own any more space in me than she already had. That night, I found myself pulling out a journal I hadn't touched in years. I started writing, not to her, not to Rowan, not to anyone, but just to myself. And once I started, I couldn't stop. Pages poured out. Things I never said. Things I'd only thought while crying in the bathroom at school when I was 13, or on the bus after a breakup in college. There was so much inside me I hadn't given a voice to because I never felt safe enough to speak it. And somehow, writing it down made it real in a way I hadn't let it be before. A few days later, I was back in Portland, walking through the farmer's market on a sleepy Sunday morning, when I ran into a woman I hadn't seen in years. Mrs. Amaze. She was one of the teachers my mother used to supervise, an English teacher, soft-spoken, always wore long scarves and talked about poetry like it was medicine. She looked older now, more tired. But when she saw me, she smiled with something like recognition and sadness. I heard about the party, she said gently. I braced myself. I'm sorry it all came to that, she added. But, your father was a good man. I'm glad someone finally spoke for him. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. She squeezed my arm and walked away. And I just stood there, holding a bag of peaches, feeling this strange, quiet sense of validation. Like the truth had rippled further than I thought. Like I wasn't crazy for seeing what I saw, knowing what I knew. Like maybe I wasn't alone in this version of reality anymore. Still, the silence from my mother remained. Her letter had been the last attempt. After I didn't respond, she didn't try again. Not directly, at least. But I started hearing things secondhand. From neighbors. From an old friend of hers who still sends me Christmas cards. She says she's devastated, one of them told me. That you won't even talk to her. I nodded. Said nothing. Because what do you say to that? I didn't stop talking to my mother because I wanted revenge. I stopped because I finally understood that peace isn't just the absence of conflict, it's the absence of constant injury. And until she could face what she did with something more than defensiveness and shame, I didn't want her in my life. Not as a footnote. Not as a haunting voice in the background. Not as a mother in name only. About 3 months after the retirement party, I got an email from the school district. Not from my mother. Not from a friend of hers. From the HR department. It was polite, professional, and curious. The woman writing said she was conducting an internal follow-up related to a personnel matter involving former leadership. She wanted to schedule a time to speak, only if I felt comfortable. I read it 3 times. It didn't take long to piece it together. The retirement party had left a ripple effect. It wasn't just a social embarrassment for my mother, it was enough to raise questions in the district. Particularly when some former staff members, and a few emboldened ones still working there, had quietly begun mentioning things. Patterns. Favors. How Dr. Bellamy had fast-tracked her on decisions, gave her hiring privileges others didn't get. How my mother, for years, wielded her role more like a private kingdom than a public school. Apparently, people had kept their mouths shut for decades. But the spectacle at the party, the photo, the letter, the breakdown, gave some of them a reason to open up. I didn't share the original photo. I didn't name names. But I did confirm what I knew. That my father had been aware of an affair that had gone on for years, likely with someone who helped her climb. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The story was already bigger than me now. I didn't hear from the district again. And I didn't need to. But about a month after that, a local education blog published an article. It didn't name her outright, but it described a controversial figure in Portland's school system whose long tenure had come under scrutiny after her retirement, tied to questions of ethics, favoritism, and an inappropriate relationship with a superior. The article didn't go viral. It didn't destroy her. But it chipped away at the curated version of her legacy that she spent her whole life polishing. She lost the volunteer board position she'd been offered at a regional education nonprofit. I know this because her name disappeared from their website 2 weeks later. She tried to play it off. I saw her Facebook post, decided to step back and focus on family. The irony was bitter. The final piece came months later, on a rainy fall afternoon. I was at a bookstore in Ashland, one I'd come to love since moving down south. I was flipping through a collection of essays when I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "I see now. You didn't destroy me. You showed them who I already was. And I don't know if I can forgive you for that, but I finally understand it." I stared at the screen for a long time. There was no name. No apology. Just that. For the first time in my life, my mother had said something that resembled accountability. It wasn't enough to fix things. But it was enough to close the door. Not slam it. Just close it. As for Rowan, he came to Ashland once. We met for coffee. Sat outside under a heat lamp, watched people pass on the sidewalk. He told me he'd started therapy. That he finally realized how much of his identity was built around avoiding conflict, how easy it had been to take the word of someone forceful over someone gentle. "I didn't just let you down," he said. "I made you think you were the problem. And you never were." It was the most honest conversation we ever had. And the last. We hugged goodbye, and that was it. He didn't ask to try again. And I didn't offer. Because what we had was good, until it wasn't. And now I wanted something different. Not just someone kind, but someone strong enough to hold space for who I am, without needing permission from anyone else to love me. My revenge was never meant to destroy my mother. It was meant to expose her. To strip away the mask she wore so comfortably for so long and show people, even herself, what lived underneath. She tried to define me with a letter. So I let my truth become louder than hers. And I walked away. Not with rage. But with peace. Because the best revenge, I've learned, is building a life you never have to apologize for. And now, finally, I'm doing just that.